Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm Andy Bryant, and joining me as usual as second pilot on this episode from Indiana, USA, someone on a one-man mission to make the Horsa glider great again. Although to be fair, it never was not great. It's my good buddy, Kevin Getz. How you doing, Kev?
I'm doing great, Andy. And I'm glad you corrected yourself because there was never a time that the Horsa wasn't great.
No argument here, mate. So our guest today is a former British Army officer, battlefield guide, historian, fellow podcaster, and author and co-author of at least two of Kevin and I's favourite Glider Pilot Regiment books. And he's joining us on this episode to talk about Operation VARSITY, the Rhine crossing in March 1945. It's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Chalky Peters. Mike, welcome to Ham and Jam.
Thank you for the invitation. I've been waiting for some time to get on Ham and Jam because I do listen to them.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a journey, but we got there in the end. So as I say, every episode, it's tradition. Starting with you as the guest, Mike, what are you drinking?
I've been drinking Brewdog Wingman. Sadly, I haven't got any in the fridge today, so I'm on the Italian.
So Kev, what are you drinking?
Today, I'm going to go with the California red wine.
Oh, well, it's an improvement over cream and soda anyway.
Oh, let me guess. What are you having?
As it is a special occasion, we got Mike on the episode finally. You know, I've been trying to diversify a little bit and branch out with my drinking.
Really?
But it's a special occasion. So, yeah, I'm drinking a Guinness.
Are you like single-handedly propping up that company?
It's my mission in life to rid the world of Guinness.
Is that the leaded version or the unleaded version?
Oh, it's the very leaded version, Mike.
Good man.
So anyway, it's traditional, gentlemen, to toast the episode in. So if you'd like to raise a glass.
Cheers.
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 Kev, away you go, mate.
Mike, thanks again for taking the time to come on with us. I think before we even delve into VARSITY, one of the things that's fascinated me, and Andy and I are very passionate about telling the story of the Glider Pilot Regiment. And certainly before we talk about VARSITY, we have to talk about what happened after Market Garden and the fact that the CO, George Chatterton, is realizing he's going to need replacements. And one of the things I saw a comment about was he'd said, we've been badly mauled. I was at a loss at how to reorganize. It was impossible to recreate the regiment because of the long preparation needed in RAF training schools. And it looked like we had come to a standstill. Is it immediately that he's realizing this, or is it a little bit later he understands I've got to find the replacements? And when is he finding out about VARSITY?
It's quite a good question because, of course, the US glider pilots are going through the same problem for different reasons. After Gavin's post after action review from Market Garden, they're being organised into company groups and militarised, etc., and trained properly, not fully on the total soldiers template, but more improved. So VARSITY comes out as a warning order early in February 45. But certainly that's on the back, as you know, and we've got to go back and think what's happened. So you get the aftermath of Market Garden and Arnhem, which, as we all know, is a disaster for the Glider Pilot Regiment. And then almost straight into the Ardennes offensive and 6 Airborne going down into the Ardennes and 17 US Airborne going into the Ardennes, etc. And everyone knows they've got to get across the Rhine. And they're also planning to cross the Elbe as well. And there are provisional plans to parachute or glide troops into Berlin. So it's very obvious to everybody that they're going to have to reconstitute the Glider Pilot Regiment. I think the problem that Chatterton got is he still thinks he can go around a total soldiery and spend all his time training people. He hasn't got that time. And that's true of all other branches as well. The British infantry from 43 onwards are constantly struggling to find enough bayonets, enough guys to actually man the ranks and maintain the industrial database as well. So it's quite early on, but also coincidentally at the same time, as you touched on, the training schedule has been overproductive. There are too many powered pilots or RAF pilots who've gone through places like Arizona and Canada, etc., and South Africa and been trained, and they're not going to have a war. There's a surplus of those pilots. But Chatterton realizes quite quickly that the losses are irreplaceable. And all the different sources I've looked at over the years, the maximum I'd say available glider pilots for VARSITY is 500. And they need 2,000 because VARSITY is going to be bigger. And the original plan for VARSITY is for 3 airborne divisions, not 2. And that's what Montgomery wants at the start. He wants 3 airborne divisions deployed, so 3 lots of gliders. The after-action review from Arnhem is such that it's like we're going to do things very differently. So we're going to use more gliders to get more weapons in when we do it. As we'll get into when we talk about the actual mission itself. So it's quite early on, within perhaps like days, but they're certainly within weeks. From February, they know they're going to have to cross the Rhine. And that's what Market Garden was all about, wasn't it? To get to the North German plane. And VARSITY is a replay of the same intent.
And this kind of folds into my next question. And I know Andy's got a copy of Chatterton's book, and I've got a copy. He talked about meeting with the RAF officials, and he said they're button heads with him a little bit. And then he goes to Air Chief Marshal Sir Peter Drummond, says, hey, this is the director of training.
Yeah.
And in his book, he goes, hey, I need these replacements. And according to him, Sir Peter goes, no problem. Snap of a finger. Was it really that easy, or did he have to work a little bit harder to get those replacements?
I don't think he had to work that hard to it, because there was this surplus, and the questions are already beginning to be asked. Everyone's got their eyes on the end of the war. What do we do with these people? How can we use them? How can we employ them? Yeah, everyone knows they're going to have to fight Japan, and the glider units being formed ready to go to Japan. There are bomber units, etc. So that's still on, but it's still not enough. It's been too good a system. It's produced so many pilots that they need to be employed. I spoke to many of those RAF pilots over the years. And it's quite interesting to hear their different views of how they found their way into the cockpit of a Horsa.
And the RAF had been trying to wrest control of the Glider Pilot Regiment anyway, away from the Army prior to that, hadn't they?
Yeah, there's a bit of, as ever, I was in the Army Air Corps for 30 odd years, and it's still the same old battle every year. Likewise, the US trying to push the glider pilots into the Army, go the other way. But time is running out, and it's almost like a pre-Arnhem scenario where the coins burning a hole in the pocket. These airborne divisions, and there are now lots of them, need to be used.
So he gets access to these pilots, and he talked about one of his hardest things he had to do was try to raise this esprit de corps that he had already established, or I shouldn't say he had already been established with what I will refer to as the originals, whether you came through with Rock or you came initially through Chatterton. Is he getting any pushback from those that had survived Arnhem? That whole notion of, well, here's our replacements. I don't know if I want to be friends with those guys.
That's a really good question. And over the years, certainly the years I ran the commemoration ceremony at Earl's Colne for Operation VARSITY, there were still very distinct lines between the RAF glider pilots and the Army glider pilots. When you read the different accounts of these guys, these RAF guys who are voluntold that they're going to be flying horses, some of them talk very differently, or their view of how they were received in these individual glider pilot squadrons when they got there are very different. The level of training they got was different. Chatterton tried to bring them in, but he realizes almost like the decision to have a second pilot that's not fully trained yet. It's like, okay, these guys need to just get them to the squadrons and get them in a cockpit, get them. Because let's not forget, these are the very capable pilots. You know, they've been trained to fly multi-engine or Spitfires or whatever. You know, the flying training is not the problem. Of course, Chatterton knows that, because Chatterton's an RAF pilot himself. So the issue is them surviving on the ground. So in a simplistic way, you've got a similar situation to what the Americans had before. You've got pilots that can fly really well, but the baggage on the ground, once they hit the ground, what are they going to do? And that's the concern. Most of the RAF guys I spoke to over the years, they were warmly received by the Army glider pilots, but whether there was an organized program at each individual glider pilot squadron to train them or not, they all went off to the RAF Regiment training depot and did small arms training and got a fast-track training set of battlefield drills and skills course, which is as per the RAF Regiment to be infantry. Then they arrive at their regiments, and the accounts really do vary a lot. Some of them say they tried in a matter of weeks to make us this total soldier who could drive a jeep, use a radio, use any weapon, all these things. And we were running in and out, jumping in a Horsa and flying and coming back. But others say, yeah, we just got there, went down the range, fired a few rounds, and that was it. And they were more concerned about, we wanted to carry on wearing our RAF stripes and our RAF wings.
One of the books that I have in my collection is Cooper's What No Engines, and that's really good account. And there's one account I've got, RAF pilot John Crane, he said, with regards to bayonet training, that didn't go down too well with the RAF pilots. We didn't join the Royal Air Force to train as infantry. Is Chatterton responsible for this accelerated program? Is he the driving force?
He gives the direction that these guys need to be made into Army glider pilots as much as can be achieved in whatever time is. They don't know when D-Day is yet for VARSITY. They know they haven't got a lot of time, but the primary thing is to get them current, qualified on Horsa and some on Hamilcar. And it really does, the attitude of the individual wing commanders and squadron commanders is very different as to how they're treated. But at the lower level, when the guys arrive at these squadrons and they're being taken into huts to meet their glider pilot, they're very warmly received. Obviously, when you read the accounts, some of the ones that we put in glider pilots on, there are some guys who clearly got PTSD from Arnhem, battle shock or whatever, but most people, and there are a lot of new replacements, and there are people who didn't go on Arnhem, so who just came through training just after or whatever. So there's a state of flux, obviously, but it's going to happen, and they're there. And what is interesting is talking to the guys about how they found their way. There's the famous story about them being a cinema full in Harrogate up in Yorkshire, being told, right, you're all going to be in the war. And others say, we were tricked into it. Hands up, who wants to fly in the war? And hands go, yeah, right, you're in the Glider Pilot Regiment. To your point about the guy with bayonet fighting, I don't know if you've ever done it, but when you stick a bayonet on a rifle, that's up close and personal. That triggers your mind. It's like, okay, right, I've got to get this close enough to do this. I joined to be fighter pilot and be back in the bar for 2 year medals afterwards or whatever.
Cooper's book, he volunteers thinking, oh, yeah, I'm going to fly. And there's like, yeah, no, you're going to be a glider pilot.
Yeah. Just imagine being told you're going to be a glider pilot, having heard what's happened at Arnhem. Being told you're going to be a glider pilot before is different to being told after Arnhem and say, oh, yeah, by the way, they had 90% casualties and you're going to go and do that now.
Let me ask this. Is that black cloud hanging over the regiment? Is it where they got to push through it and it's the war?
The boys I talked to said that in some squadrons which are hit worse than others, if you're in the hole where you're the only one left, there's a bit of that. But there's a lot of people who'll leave, people coming back from being wounded. It's like the war's nearly over. Let's crack on. We're still flying. Yeah. There's an awareness. And this is what's interesting about VARSITY. Most people are thinking the war's going to be over by Christmas. It should have been over by last Christmas, but it's going to be over for this Christmas. I think one of the most interesting things that underpins the whole VARSITY thing and that period of the war, because it's so often ignored and glossed over, those last few months of the war, is that every other glider mission has been a mission of liberation. This is an invasion into a hostile territory where if you're a paratrooper or you're a glider pilot and you're hanging in a tree or trapped in a wreck, you don't know what reception you're going to get from the German civilian populace. And everyone's heard stories about bomber crews being hung from lampposts and all this kind of thing. So there's that factor to it as well, psychologically, I think, which is, if you're an RAF, a newly appointed RAF glider pilot, it's like, hey, this is not what I signed up for.
Was there an attempt to actually integrate the crews?
Yeah, a lot of the squadron said it would be one RAF, one Army in every cockpit. But then you do read accounts of 2 RAF pilots in the same aircraft because there just aren't enough Army pilots to do that. I'll come back to my point earlier. They are good pilots, even though a Horsa is very different to flying a powered aircraft. They've done all the basic training, and once they've fulfilled themselves, some of them are talking about how agile a Hamilcar was once in the air and how much they enjoyed flying the Horsa and the dive down, etc. So it was a different kind of flight.
When do we start seeing that, okay, VARSITY is going to happen? Now we start doing the in-depth planning, and what are they tasked with? What's going to be happening with the 6th Airborne Division?
So the 6th Airborne get the orders for VARSITY in February. They start to prepare the plan for that. There's a bit of conundrum around that. But the thing that comes out straight away about VARSITY is it's going to be glider-led because it's all about the after-action review from Arnhem. One of the biggest things is we're not going to land miles away from our objective. We're going to land on the objective. And hey, this coup d'arme thing, the Americans have got 10 bridges to take and the British have got 3. So there's 13 bridges to be captured in one fell swoop. So all these lessons are being woven into it. And at the time, 1st Allied Airborne Army under Brereton has the task. It's given to 1st British Airborne Corps under Windy Gale. Montgomery is planning Operation Plunder, which VARSITY is part of. And that's going to be a crossing of the Rhine of US 9th Army, British 2nd Army, crossing 300 meters width of the Rhine, which is the biggest anti-tank ditch in Europe, with a current of 5 miles an hour. For the Germans, this is a huge psychological barrier because for them, the Rhine is the final barrier before the fatherland. If we get into Germany, they're actually going to break into the German homeland, or as Montgomery, when he's upbeat, says, we're going to bounce the Rhine. And he's planning a monumental, almost Great War scale attack where the US 9th Air Force is going to be bombing by day for a month beforehand, bombing behind the lines and any target and trying to tempt German flak guns to open fire so they can destroy them. but the German anti-aircraft gun crews that are being moved into the area around Basel and Hammelkelm are all veterans. They know to keep their guns masked until the day they need it. So they don't engage. A lot of them just don't engage. So on the day when the gliders are making their approach and being told most of the flak guns have been knocked out, they're still very much alive and kicking. You're talking about, I think the figures I looked at when I did my research was 145 large caliber, that's 88 millimeter and above, and a total of 800 flak guns. The remainder being 20 millimeter and 30 millimeter cannons. So that's heavily defended because the Germans know there's going to be an airborne component to this crossing. There has to be. What they don't know is that the Allies, having learned from the bitter experience of Arnhem, aren't going to put the airborne troops in first. They're going to do the ground crossing, the river crossing first, and then reinforce with the airborne. They're going to do the other way around. That's the only thing they can do that's different.
You had talked about, obviously, Market Garden is in everybody's minds.
Yeah.
That failure. How much is the success of the coup de main operations in Normandy, is that entering the picture at all? Obviously, Pegasus Bridge and the assault on Merville Battery. Is any of that also playing a factor, or is it primarily the failure of Market Garden that's really driving this plan?
That's a good way of looking at it, because the failure of Market Garden looms large, but the lessons have been learned. Unfortunately, the Germans have a copy of the after-action review from Market Garden, which they captured. So they know what lessons have been learned. They'll war game their plan appropriately. But you're right. Coup de main, I've been writing about Eben Amel today. And then you look at Sicily, Ponte Grande, and Primosole, etc. And then you look at Pegasus Bridge and Horsa Bridge. Coup de main is very much there. And having gone through not doing a coup de main, because we know Jefferson offered coup de main over Arnhem Bridge and was refused. So this says, okay, coup de main is back. And the big lesson we learned at Arnhem was land on the objectives. Take the casualties in the first hour, not over 7 days. So the whole reason for VARSITY being constructed the way it is, and basically this immense river crossing is going to happen. But once they get across, they need to know that the Germans can't push them back into the river. And that is about these 13 bridges on the River Issel and the Issel Canal. So going in conventionally over land to capture these bridges, which they know are prepared for demolition by the German defenders, is not an option. They have to be captured at the same time quickly. So VARSITY will start on the 23rd of March and run all day. And then at 10 o'clock in the morning, 1000 hours, the next morning, the VARSITY will happen and reinforce plunder by parachute, by glider. But the bridges will be captured by gliders, American and British, all in coup de main. There's a lot of ironies about VARSITY, given that it's the most successful glider operation, yet it's the last. I mean, if I can digress for a minute, my point on this is always the Germans go through Eben Amel and Blitzkrieg, and we all talk about Eben Amel like Pegasus Bridge. We don't talk about the Hague, where their aircraft got shot out of the sky, or the other bridge on the Albert Canal, where the bridge got blown, they didn't take it. Airborne warfare is an optimistic game, isn't it? The glass is half full all the time. The big question when you do staff flights of the military, is this a risk or is this a gamble? And what's the difference? So I think you've got the Germans after Mercury, after Crete, saying, yeah, this is a non-starter unless you've got complete air supremacy and all these things, and using their gliders to carry spares around the Eastern Front and things, or very small operations. Like coming the other way down the tracks is the Brits and the Americans going, hey, gliders, this is the way ahead. Yeah, they have got air supremacy or got superiority at least. So they can justify it, and it's worth the risk. It's not a gamble, it's a risk. So it's a calculating. VARSITY is a risk. Learn all those things. So you're going to go against 712 light flak guns and 114 heavy flak guns, 150 armoured vehicles, and about, the estimates vary from 7,500 to 12,000 infantry, including Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. It's a big thing to do. But, you know, the Ox and Bucks are in there. The Royal Ulsters are in there. Not the same company that's going to be used. It's B Company and C Company, I think. But it's still the Ox and Bucks. So I think it's interesting. And a lot of the myths surrounding it, like the fact that US-17 Airborne is a non-veteran unit. They just come out of the Ardennes. They didn't fly in. They didn't drop in, but they fought in the Ardennes and took horrendous casualties. And had to be reinforced to make them up for VARSITY. And they've got a lot of 101st and 82nd veterans in the 17th US to give them the backbone and the knowledge and experience. So their commanding officer is ex-deputy commander of 82nd. So it's interesting. The thing is, Montgomery doesn't want Gale. You talk about Arnhem and the aftertaste of on. Montgomery does not want Windy Gale's 1st British Airborne Corps to be the spearhead. He wants Ridgway to do it. And the reason he says that he doesn't dislike Gale, because we all know Gale's a perfectly capable airborne commander. The reason he says he wants the US Airborne Corps and 18 Corps, not British Corps, is because their communications are better. And he's still scarred by the core communications of 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Eisenhower overrules everybody. He says, okay, you can have Ridgway. Ridgway's not interested. He's busy being a ground corps commander and actually goes to meet Gale. And the two of them get on like a house on fire. He respects Gale and says, looked at his plan and with a few amendments goes, nothing wrong with this plan. I think it's great. And it's Gale and Ridgway who say to Montgomery, you don't need the 3rd Division. It's the 13th, US 13th Division, who never saw action in World War II, are fitting out in France, ready to go. So this is not the 82nd or 101st, which I find fascinating. This is 17 and 13. And 1st Airborne are still shattered. British Airborne are still shattered from Arnhem, so they're not in play. So 13 are sidetracked and they're going to do the operation that's cancelled further down on the Rhine. So it's 17 US Airborne, and it's going to be bigger than Ben-Hur. And we all know that the Mark II is used. So there's lots of other innovations. It's the first use of American glider pilots trained to fight on the ground properly. They go by daylight, as per Arnhem, because of the night fighter threat is just too great. And the ground troops are going to cross the river first before the airborne, which is new, doesn't follow any of the previous mission template. And it's the only time that the Waco is going to be towed to double tow on a mission. And the use of the C-46 make a huge difference because the C-46 can carry a platoon and it's got 2 doors. So you can jump out both sides at once. So your dispersion of your parachute sticks is much tighter. And if you're going to fly with 2 Wacos behind the same tow, you can have a complete platoon. As we all know, the wonderful horse can do that anyway, but the 2 Wacos together in daylight, they actually stand a chance of landing in the same field. And the biggest thing that comes out of the planning for VARSITY is it's all going to be done in one lift. There's no second or third lift. And right behind all of that will be 240 B-24 Liberators from the 8th Air Force who will do the first resupply. There's more gliders this time than previously, the ratio. So it's on steroids. It's compared to previous operations. VARSITY is right. Okay, all the things we've learned, we're going to put them all in. We're going to do this right.
You had mentioned this is the first use of the Horsa Mark II. What is the biggest advantage in your mind that the Horsa Mark II has over the Mark I?
It's twofold. Firstly, in the loading, and secondly, in the unloading. It's simple as, because you know that to get a Jeep into a Horsa Mark I is a complete nightmare. The Horsa Mark I was designed to carry motorcycles, bicycles, and infantry. It was never designed to carry a Jeep or a 6-pounder. So you've got to get it on there, do that whole shimmy thing. And when I talked to a lot of the glider pilot veterans, they used to be more scarred by that than they were by the actual combat. It was like the sweating and riding over loading and unloading these things. The main spine of a Horsa can only be under load for 48 hours. So you have to load it. So all those cancelled ops on and off the bus, you're putting those Jeeps on it, and then you could go through the whole same thing again. And then you've got that hassle of landing a Mark I and getting the tail off, assuming you're not under fire. If you had a rough landing, then it's warped, the bolts are twisted, etc. People always say to me, what do they do with the gliders afterwards? And on none of the operations did any respectable number of gliders make it back. So that's because they crashed. No, it's not because they crashed. It's a wooden aircraft being landed underweight in a field.
I think that comes up virtually every episode Kev and I do. We somehow managed to squeeze in that about horses did not crash. Or they weren't designed to crash anyway.
Pardon me while I go into my panic room and scream.
So the main thing is obviously with the Mark II is it's so much easier to unload, so much quicker. So going back to my last point about the C-46 and all these other things, everything's going to be a wave of things. Everything's going to be done much more quickly, more rapidly. Airborne forces, the most vulnerable time is when they land initially. If you can reduce that window of vulnerability by doing all these different things they did, then you've got a better chance of surviving and actually achieving the mission.
The infantry predominantly went in the Horsa Mark Is.
Yes, because they don't need a fancy opening door. That's all they need.
Yeah.
Is this the first battle that the Locust is flown in?
It is. It doesn't do very well, as the Tetrarch didn't do very well. That's one of the great questions people always say to me. What would you have changed for Arnhem? Maybe the Hamilcars should have brought the Tetrarchs in, and maybe Gottreki Dash might have gone a bit better with the sound of tanks. Not that they've actually seen it enough fall, but the sound of tracks might have given them a bit of a chance. But It's a huge what if, isn't it? I think you'd rather carry more artillery if you're going to give up that weight, or more ammunition, or more Piats or whatever.
So we're on the cusp of Varsity getting ready to happen. D-Day it's scheduled for March 24th. The glider pilots who survived Arnhem, now that we're closer to it's actually happening, is there any self-doubt at all? Like, are we staring down another market garden again? Or is this a case of, okay, let's just plow forward. This is going to end the war. Let's get on with our job and finish it.
Difficult to answer that question because they were genuinely upbeat people anyway, and it's stiff upper lip. And a lot of the guys said to me over the years that, yeah, we could whinge and whine and complain, but we only fought for a week at a time. We weren't fighting our way from Sword Beach all the way through to the Rhine. And you look at the attrition rate in those battalions, they were aware of all that because they were in the army and they had relatives, brothers, cousins, etc., who were in the infantry on tank crews, slogging their guts across Northwest Europe. So I think they thought they had a good billet. They were there. You take your chances and get on with it. There were also a number of guys like David Brook, who I knew, who only did varsity. He only did varsity. This is the glider, the photograph you see of the burnt-out glider at Hamilton Rail Yard. That was his only mission. But, that was a story to tell. So I think generally across the whole force, there will always be somebody who's like worried or fearful or whatever. But most people are like, let's get this done and finish the war. Because in their mind, there was going to be another one after that, maybe crossing the Elbe or going and taking Berlin. We have 2020 hindsight. We know what happened. They didn't know that.
Yeah.
There was that nervousness about landing in Germany.
Was there any preparation for any of that based on what they were hearing from any intelligence that was finding its way from Germany via POWs or escapees?
Yeah, lots of talk about non-fraternization, be prepared to fight Hitler Youth and old men as well on bicycles, and last-ditch battles by the Germans. Conversely, the Germans knew we were coming and actually knew pretty much that where Montgomery was going to cross was near Xanten, because the same as Market Garden, the plan was to drive to the North German plain, head for the Ruhr, cut out the industrial heart of Germany and force what was left of German armour into one last-ditch tank battle on the North German plain where Typhoons and Thunderbolts could rip them apart because they would have to defend the Ruhr. When people say, why didn't they go with Bradley or with Patton or the bridge of Remagen? And you've only got to look at the map and see that Montgomery had it right. And his stock's quite high after the Ardennes because he performs well around the Ardennes and afterwards. And his plan is very much steel, not flesh. Do whatever you can to minimise casualties. And there's no pressure, but Churchill's going to be there on the day to watch as well. And quite famously went for P in the Rhine because that's what he said he wanted to do.
The operation is happening. Victor Miller commented about his flying into trying to find the LZ. And he said he hung on for dear life, hoping to find a gap. And he just basically was hoping for a glimpse of any opening. What's happening and why is it becoming so difficult for these guys to land?
The guy who was in command of the German forces up until 2 days before is General Alfred Schlemm, who's an ex-paratrooper who planned Mercury. So he just reverse engineers. He said, okay, they're going to use airborne forces. He's got the after-action review from Arnhem. They're not going to land near the objectives. I know where they're going to land. Thankfully, he doesn't have time to put glider poles out and all that kind of thing. He sets up his defences with armour on the other side behind the bridges. So they're not going to be in artillery fire and exposed to air attack. He brings in all these flat guns we've spoken about of various calibers and fortifies all the houses and strong points, barns and farm complexes he can to make strong points that will create killing grounds anywhere around the place, and certainly puts flak around the bridges. The bridges are prepared for demolition, but they want to keep them intact so that the German counterattack, the German panzers can roll across the bridges to push plunder back into the sea is what they're for. And he knows that we want the bridges because it's the only thing we haven't bombed. A month beforehand, 9th Air Force has been bombing everything apart from these 13 bridges. And this guy's not stupid. He knows exactly where Varsity is going to land. So they're ready. We're ready because British, Canadian and American troops are ready to do what they've got to do. There are training exercises in the UK, and that does help the RAF glider pilots to get in the mood. And a lot of them, they really enjoyed it. And the artillery, you've got two armies, US 9th and British 2nd Army, all of their artillery lined up, World War I style, to blast away. And the 9th US Air Force bombing as well. And then from the 21st of March, Montgomery's got across the whole frontage, 22 miles, smoke generators. And he's created a cloud of smoke so that the Germans can't see on the home bank pathways being laid down to the back to get to the landing craft. Royal Navy landing craft have been brought over land from Normandy to go across the Rhine. It's a fantastic undertaking. And the plan is that the smoke will stop the night before the operation. So on the 23rd, the smoke stops, the crossing start. On the morning of the 24th, 2 armies worth of artillery blasting away on the far bank. Then 15 minutes before L hour, when the first glider will land at 1000 hours, that stops. So the smoke will have cleared, the guns will stop, and the gliders will begin to land, and the paratroopers will come in. It's a classic Montgomery set piece operation. Crossing an obstacle like that, it has to be set piece. Unless you capture one bridge like Ramada and you can dash across it. There's no other way of doing it.
But it didn't quite go that way when it came to the actual landings, did it?
No, it didn't. I was talking to David Brooke, actually, and he told me about exercise Token. 6 hawsers flew the route a week before. They didn't cross the Rhine, but they flew the whole route to make sure the fuel calculations and weight loads were right. They flew it concrete loads in the gliders, not actual troops. And I was dumbfounded by this because one of the glider pilots told me that when he was guarding German prisoners, he got talking to one of the Germans, and the German said, because they'd flown I think that Token was on the Sunday, they'd flown it, the mission was on the Saturday. And he said to him, well, the war's over for you. He said, yeah. He said, you did a really good operation, Tommy, but you were late. He said, what do you mean we were late? He said, well, we saw the gliders last week and they were over half an hour earlier. That's hearsay, but it's plausible when you think that Token happened. And the gliders were early, so it didn't go quite to plan. The smoke didn't clear as it should have. The gliders arrived early, and that made it very difficult for artillery fire direction, critical, and also for glider pilots coming into land. Interestingly, you asked about why was it so difficult? I think one of the big reasons was because the Germans had massed all those flak guns and kept them covered. They were waiting for the right moment, quite professionally. And a lot of the hawsers came down from 2,000 feet, which is a long way and a really long time to be exposed to flak. I always make the point about the Waco being quite hard to get down quickly. Even a hawser from 2,000 feet is going to struggle to get down. The paratroopers are jumping. Some jumped as low as 300 feet, but that was an exception. Most jumped from 500 to 600 feet, so they were in the air 35 seconds, 45 seconds, depending where they jumped. So they were exposed as well. So there was a lot of flak and a lot of targets for the flak. But the coup de Marne, Ox and Bucks had 2 bridges to go to. Royal Ulsters had 1. They took their bridges. 17 platoon of C company, I think. Ox and Bucks were wiped out when the lead glider was hit at about 1,800 feet, I think. And I think 13 gliders were shot down on the way in. Out of the total force of 440, only 88 gliders were unscathed, i.e. not hit by enemy fire of some kind.
Wow.
So that was a maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire they were flying into. I spoke to Des Page. He was with the Ox and Bucks on one of the bridges. He said it was a real old ding-dong of a battle. The Germans weren't going to run this time. They were fighting for the homeland, and that's the big factor. They were on home turf, fighting for the home ground, especially with Volksturm. It is literally your home turf you're on. So it was a determined fight.
You read in some of the accounts that as the guys are coming in, you got their second pilots firing their Sten guns through the cockpit. Just to look at the photographs from after they've landed, how close some of them gliders landed to the anti-aircraft guns is literally on top of them.
Mike, have you been able to find out in any of your research were most of the RAF pilots killed either in the air or in the process of landing?
So if you look at the glider pilot casualties, there's 98 killed and 77 wounded. So it depends where you interpret the figures. The old figure used to be 101, and it was 51 RAF and 50 Army glider pilots. It was a clear split. And in the early days, I thought that's because there were mixed crews, but it wasn't that. Most of them were hit on the approach to land, or just as they were in the glider. So I'd say in the glider, either on the ground or on the way down. Some of them do get involved in firefights afterwards, obviously, but most of them are hit as they come in. I mean, 30% casualties compared to 90% at Arnhem. Casualties being killed, wounded, missing as well. And the number of, three separate coup de Marnes by the Brits, all those done by the Americans as well. And 17th Airborne Division do really well, all things considered. They do exceptionally well. So there's lots of things that come out of it, like the C-46 for all its advantages. It was rushed into service. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. So we're back in Sicily again.
Is that a product of just let's hurry up and get these things chucked out? Or
I don't know why they were built to that. So 19 out of 72 C-46s were shot down. So that's got to be flak, not our fighters, because there's no fighter interdiction. But They didn't have self-sealing fuel tanks. And also, I don't know the technical reason for it, but the way that the fuel is drained once the tank is empty, there's a way that happens. On C-46, it sat in a sump on the fuel tanks, which is at the wing roots. So when it was hit, the whole thing went. A hard lesson learned there with the Curtiss C-46.
I think the American paratroopers struggled with it as well because they've been so used with the Dakota. As they go out the door, they're turning right, and obviously on the C-46 you've got two doors, and the guys who are on that side of the plane was literally sitting there saying into themselves in their head, turn left, turn left, turn left, because they're so used to turning right out the door. Because
if you don't exit properly, your parachute doesn't open properly. If your body gets caught in the slipstream, it goes wrong. It can affect the canopy opening. So there's a lot of casualties in that way. I just look at my figures again. It's 146 Mark 1s, 246 Mark 2s, and 48 Hamilcar. It's the biggest airborne operation of the war. I would argue it's the most successful, even over Normandy. And that personalities involved, Windy Gale, capable guy, very capable guy. And Ridgway doesn't want to tread on his toes. Ridgway controversially doesn't jump in. He comes across over the river. I sort of thought thought, if he's let Gale command the whole mission, why would he take the glory and jump in? As a corps commander, what influence is he going to have on what is basically a bar fight for the first 24 hours?
We did an episode with Ben Main, and we had talked about the leadership style and the leadership capabilities of Windy Gale. Give us a sense of Eric Bowles, who is now the replacement. How is he as a divisional commander?
He only took over in February. What an act to follow. How do you follow Gale? And the people around him, if ever there's a guy who actually really is an American because he's got proper teeth and a good firm jaw and he's 6 foot whatever, it's Hill, isn't it? He's like an iconic paratrooper, people are, he's just fantastic commanders who are still there. And I do question some of these guys who never get promoted. Everyone talks about Frost, the best battalion commander the British Army ever had. Why didn't he get promoted then? These guys are very distinct personalities in the way they go about their business. And Browning always gets a really hard time. So I think you've got to be a certain kind of guy to be an airborne commander in World War II, because now there's a template for what an airborne commander is because they've been around for 80 years. But then it's like they're wearing jumpers and riding trousers and the crop or whatever. It's just you just got to be a personality and a leader. So I think Bowles does okay.
Andy and I always joke because, well, he wasn't an airborne man. And we always say, well, who was an airborne man?
Well, you can get into a bit of Urquhart bashing as well, can't you, for that reason? It's just, and I think that's unfair as well. You've got to look at the circumstances and the values of the time. The biggest problem I find with history is when people apply 21st century values to 1815 or what it is. You've got to apply the values of the time and ask yourself what information was available to those guys at the time and what was expected of them at the time. What did people expect of their officers in 1945 compared to now? I think the guys who went on VARSITY wanted to get the war done. It's a bit like the first day of the summer when you get told, we're going to be shelling them for a month. We're going to have a smoke screen. We've got night Air Force bombing. We've got this, we've got that. Okay, everything that can be done is being done. We're here, so let's get on with it. 500 British and American fighters with a stream. Stream of aircraft was 3.5 hours long. The whole thing about getting there as well, because for the glider squadrons, they're all in the wrong place. They all had to move to East Anglia. They all had to shift locations. Hence, B Squadron, who had started at Bryce Norton, had gone to Manston for Arnhem, then had to move across to Essex to Earl's Colne for VARSITY, because they were being told their affiliated squadron, I think it was 296, were Albemarle's, who just didn't have the range. Every British paratrooper was dropped by American aircraft, again, because 38, 48, 6 Group RAF were busy towing gliders, every single one of them. No Pathfinders were used because everyone knew where the landing zones were. They still went. They didn't just go on to the job. Artillery observers were dropped on the other bank. That was it. And you got the 6th Air Landing Brigade moved out to Earl's Colne, Great Dunmow, Matching, Rivenhall, Shepherd's Grove, Woodbridge in Suffolk, and Gosfield. So all at Essex and Suffolk to give the tugs the range to get to Germany.
If there's ever a time for steel not flesh, this is certainly the moment because it's going to be over with and nobody is thinking, gee, I want to be that last guy killed before it's over.
I think they did it right. All things considered, what else could they have done?
I know you spent a lot of time with the Glider Pilot Regiment veterans over the years. Have you got any particular favourite stories or experiences of spending time with those guys?
I spent a lot of time with Mike Dauncey and a lot of time with Arthur Shackleton. I went to Arthur Shackleton's wedding when Arthur got married again, and I think he was 78. and went down to Dorset for his wedding, absolutely packed. And when the vicar said, has anyone got any reason why these two people shouldn't be joining marriage? But Arthur just turned around and said, I'm only marrying her for a washing machine. She's got a washing machine. I haven't.
He does come across as a character whenever I've seen him in interviews. And some of those interviews, I think you were interviewing him, but he comes across as a real character.
I've still got his escape map, which was in his pocket when he swam the Rhine or floated down the Rhine. And he remembers being almost unconscious, thinking, I'm going to die, and wondering where his body would end up as he was in the Rhine and where it was going to come out. And then hearing a Canadian voice say, hey, there's a dead one here, we'll pull him out. And he said, I'm not dead, I'm a glider pilot.
I think my favourite one is where he's recounting the story about Market Garden. They're flying over the churches. And he said, all the people came out to wish us well and pray for us. He said, didn't do us any good, did it?
No. Jim Hooper, his stories about some 13 platoon South Staffs into Arnhem and the crashes before and how he'd saved them. And I think it was 3 times he'd had to make forced landings with the same platoon in the back. It had all gone wrong, snapped tow ropes and things like that. On the move down to Manston, he got summoned to Ian Toller's office, who was the OC of B Squadron, and said, thought I was in deep trouble. And he said, we're going to take you off flying because you've had 3 cracks of the whip. The next time you might not be so lucky. And anyway, he went away and he came back and got sent for again back to Toller's office. And he goes in there and the OC of the company is there, who's the VC with Major Kane. And he's there with Toller. He says, right, you're back on the opposite 13 platoon. He said, you've got them out of shit 3 times now and they don't want anyone else flying them into Arnhem. It's got to be you. So when he lands at Arnhem, he doesn't go to the rally point. He follows them down to the museum, down to into the battle and get taken prisoner with the South Staffs. Mike Dauncey, the most self-effacing man I ever met. I think he told me a story about how he found out about his DSO and he read about it in the Flight magazine. Nobody told him officially. He read it in Flight magazine in the mess. And then when he and his wife were going down to Buckingham Palace to see the King to get a medal, he received a letter through the post and it was from Boy Browning. Boy Browning said, you're going to see the King, a second pilot. I think you should be a first pilot. I'll send you my wings. So whenever people talk about Boy Browning, I always say that first. Well, let's just look at this story as a mark of the guy.
Boy Browning is going to be the subject of an upcoming episode. We're working on that.
Dirk Bogart didn't do him any favours, did he?
And I think even Dirk Bogart would be the first to acknowledge that.
One last one about Mike Dauncey. I walked the battlefield with him, went to Kate's horse house with him and all that. It was an immense privilege. Now, I know people use that word a lot, but it was. I spent days with him. It was fantastic. And me and Luke. And he, in 2010, I was doing the battlefield bike ride for Help for Heroes as one of the historians with 3 others. And the pilgrimage was there. And Mike was the head of the Airborne pilgrimage. And there was all these cyclists there. And I told his story on the walk of the VC action around the bakery and his eye injury and all that. And I said, I'll see if I can get him to talk to us. I went over to Mike Dauncey and we had a really nice chat and all that. I said, would you do me a favour? Would you mind talking to the cyclists who cycled 300 miles to raise money for Help for Heroes? And I will, Chalky, but only on one condition. And I said, what's that? He said, I don't have to talk about myself. And I thought that was an amazing thing to say. So he came over. Well, I got them all over to him. And he's there in his suits, his beret, all his medals and his kit. And he starts talking to me and said, I just tell you, and bear in mind he was 5 foot and a cigarette butt. Very slight man. He said, last week I did a tandem skydive for Help for Heroes to raise money as well. And then he pulled his sleeve up and he was wearing a Help for Heroes bracelet. So I'd just like to say, well done to you guys for doing that. They're an amazing bunch of men. And I say it all the time. I never heard any one of them call themselves elite. I never, with very few exceptions, heard any of them big themselves up as a regiment. I went to all the AGMs over the years and there was all the great stories about Rock and Chatterton and all those things people talk about now. But back in the day, nobody knew who they were. When I first went to Middle Wallop on the remembrance service for the Army Air Corps, they didn't have anywhere to go. The artillery observation post, because they were all officers, went to the officers' mess. And nobody really knew who the glider pilot, because they'd been pushed out with the new Army Air Corps. So we changed all that. We had a room in the mess named the Arnhem room, which Fred Corrie, VARSITY veteran, he would phone me every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock in the morning from his house in Portobello, London, for a chat. And I'd lie there after a big Saturday night. That's when the phone would start ringing. And I'd think, why call I? And I think he was the last RSM of the regiment. And he'd say, morning, Sergeant Major. And we'd have this chat about whatever. So, yeah, great bunch of men.
Yeah, brilliant.
It's really fascinating to me, too, because how they developed a culture and a reputation in such a short time. Andy and I had talked about this before. This isn't the Coldstream Guards. There isn't a long history with the glider pilots, but yet, boy, in a short period of time, they really established themselves as a highly regarded regiment.
I used to, when I used to train NCOs in the Army Air Corps, I'd say, you haven't got this continuous line, but you have the Royal Flying Corps, another body of men like that. You have the Glider Pilot Regiment, the AOP pilots. This was back in the 80s and 90s. And we started to have Arnhem dinners and Sicily dinners and things like that. And you can be the Coldstream Guards, but there's nobody from Waterloo going to sit at the table. You guys are sat around the table with the men who fought in the finest hour of your cap badge. Yeah, we had Jim Warwick sat at the table, Arthur Shepperton. I did the Army Air Corps backfield study in 94 with Jim Warwick, Jeff Barkway, Peter Doyle, and John Howard was there as well, and Roy Howard, who flew onto Horsa Bridge. All these guys would say, I'm not going to tell you what happened. You tell me what happened here, and you get some interesting. Pensis Bridge is a really interesting story because, the actual truth compared to what actually happened is a very different thing. But they're very candid, really nice. They're all gentlemen, but I wouldn't like to meet them on the battlefield. Pretty good at what they did.
Just to give our listeners perspective of what we're talking about with Varsity, when you said this thing was massive, we're talking about more than 4,000 troops, 342 Jeeps, 14 lorries, 12 17-pounders, 50 6-pounders. It really gives one a sense of scale of how massive this thing was.
That's a great lead up, actually, Kev. So my question is that's going to be, so Mike, in your opinion, was Varsity the pinnacle of World War II airborne operation, or was it actually an unnecessary extravagance?
Good question. That list that Kev's just come out with is just 6 air landing brigades. So you multiply that by the other brigades and 17 US Airborne Division and that 3.5 column of aircraft and all that sort of thing. Is this the pinnacle of airborne operations? Simple answer, yes. And I think context, we didn't start doing airborne operations until 1943. I don't count freshmen. I count freshmen as a special forces operation. I don't count that as an air landing op. But Sicily is July 43. Here we are in March 1945, not even 2 years later, doing that level of operation and that complexity on that scale successfully. And people say, oh, they didn't need to do it. Who else was going to take those bridges before the Germans blew them? There was no other way of doing it. So was it worth? Yes, clearly it was, I think. And did they do it the right way? Look at the casualty figures compared to Arnhem. And what I think is really important is you guys have highlighted it with this podcast, and especially within all of that is the RAF glider pilots getting a mention because, for a lot of time, for whatever reason, their own self-harming and want to be separate and some people not want to, there was this gulf. And I think their contribution needs to be recognised because, that was an amazing thing they did as well to step out of the Royal Air Force training programme thinking you're going to go and fly transport aircraft or Lightcasters to then find yourself engaging German anti-aircraft gunners in a different way with a Sten gunner and a grenade. So that's true bravery and true grit, isn't it, in every sense. So I think, yes, it was the pinnacle of airborne operations in the World War II sense. Gliders will never be used again. They'll hang around for a couple of years. They'll never be used again. Paratrooping will never happen again. Musketeer in 56, that's it. Night drops in Afghanistan. It's not the thing. In this day and age, apart from a show of force or political thing, airborne activity as on this template is never going to be seen again. I would give anything to watch that happen. That scale, that level of power in the sky, 500 fighter escort, 3.5 hour column of aircraft, all that artillery, Kudamars landing on the bridge. The German effort is pretty impressive as well, but it just wasn't going to be good enough. So yeah, well done to them. Nothing is impossible, as they would say.
Yeah, nothing is impossible. Well, what can I say? Thanks ever so much, Mike. That's been brilliant. Kev?
That was just, as they say, cracking good stuff.
We're going to say thanks ever so much to Mike for joining us. Thanks for listening. And time, gentlemen, please, on this episode. And Ham and Jam.
Ham and Jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Well, it's normally my bit that hit the cutting room floor, to be fair.